Now, when I was getting into photography, learning where to focus in order to get everything in the image front to back tack sharp was one of the more challenging aspects. So this morning I've come down to Pier just before sunrise, and we'll try and show you where to focus, how to get that image perfectly tack sharp, settings to use, and hopefully it'll help you out. So if you're just getting into photography and you want to know more about focus and getting a nice sharp image, this is the video for you. So let's get started. Hopefully the sunrise in about 10 minutes, nicely behind the pier, and we'll get a good shot. There's a little bit of cloud detail, so it's looking promising. So this is the first composition we're going for. We've got the pier sort of stretching out into the sea. We've got the sunrise, which will hopefully happen just behind it. And then we've got a circular polarizer on and a 6-stop ND just to smooth out the sea, make that a nice sort of ethereal look. Anyway, in terms of focusing, what we're going to do is we're going to set our f-stop to f16, which will give us a lot in focus. And then we're going to focus probably about a third of the way down the pier. And that should give us most of it in focus. So I am focusing right about here on the pier, somewhere between those two buildings. We're just focusing on that, and at f16 that should give everything in nice crisp focus. Now I would say this represents probably 80–90% of my shots, where you've got quite a big subject in the frame and you want to get it all in focus. You know, it could be a wall leading up something to give you a nice leading line, it could be a cliff edge, could be, you know, a body of water and you've got something in the sort of mid-ground and you want to keep that in focus as well. So I'd say a lot of my shots use this sort of technique of focusing about a third to a halfway into the image. So now we've got that shot, I'm going to zoom in, scroll around a little bit on the camera just to see what's in focus, make sure everything is pin sharp before we leave the location, because otherwise you don't want to get home and find that it's not how you wanted it to be. So let's do that. Let's go on to the image, zoom right in. So upon zooming in, what I've found is the front is actually pin sharp. The end, not quite there in my opinion. It's almost very, very close, but not quite. So what we'll do is I think we'll move our focus point a little bit further. No shame in that. You know, take the shot, experiment, zoom in, and then see what it looks like. Now obviously this acts as a very good starting point, that third to a halfway into the image. But don't just, you know, blindly rely on it. What you want to do is take a few shots, go onto your camera's view, check the actual photo itself, zoom right in as far as you can, sort of zoom around and make sure that everything is pin sharp front to back, and then adjust your focus point accordingly. Because obviously every scene will be slightly different, and the worst thing is when you get home only to find out that the real photo that you want is a bit blurry or out of focus, and you may never get it again. So it's definitely worth taking the time. So in the end with this one, I focused a bit further towards the main head of the pier, a bit further out, and I feel like that's given me the best shot overall. But definitely the place to start was that halfway down the pier. That worked really well as sort of a beginner focus point. Well, now the sun's risen up a little bit, I've moved closer to the pier in order to get that sun directly behind sort of the head of the pier at the very end. And I've gone for a 10-stop ND, which gave me a nice 30-second exposure. There's a little bit of a breeze, so the clouds are streaking through the photo, and we've got that stunning light right behind the pier. Absolutely wonderful. Okay, so I would say that covers most of my photos, but what do you do when you've got no clear subject? Here, we're underneath the pier, we've got all of the pier structure heading out into the sea. There's no clear subject in this image. We really want the whole thing to just be the subject. So what do you do here? Well, it's kind of the worst case scenario, really. What I'm probably going to do is stick to that sort of third of the way into the image. So we're probably going to focus on like one of these pier structures here, probably the second one in. And I think at f16, that will give us a nice depth of field right the way through the image and get everything acceptably sharp. Really, when you've got something this close and the pier head that far away, the only way to get everything pin sharp is to focus back again. But because we've got the water here, I don't really want to do that, to be honest. I could do, but I really just want to get this all in one shot if I can. So we are focusing right on one of these, just about there. That's our focus point. Now the other good starting point for where to focus, if you've got, say, a big vista, got a big sunset, mountain range, something like that, is to start your focus at infinity. And what they'll do is it'll make the bottom of your image, so those foreground objects, the bits that are a bit closer to the camera, just a little bit out of focus, which I feel draws your eye into the main part of the image, say that impressive sunset or those impressive mountains in the background, and that can really work well. Now is again, good starting point. These are all good starting points. You really want to take a few shots, zoom in, check what's in shot, what's in focus, what isn't, and go from there. Okay, so I think that covers off what I would class as the difficult shots, where you've got a lot to get in focus, and you ideally don't want to be messing around with focus stacking. But what can you do when you just have one easy subject, such as a tree in a woodland, and you just really want to accentuate that subject and really make it stand out against everything else that's there? Well then, you can open up the aperture and really just focus on that one single subject. Nice and easy. Let's jump to the woodland and I'll show you how it's done. I cannot tell you how nice it is to be in the woodland after a frankly hectic morning at the beach. Waves crashing, noise, lots of pressure getting the sunrise shots. And now we're just out in a woodland, no one around, nice and peaceful, still a little breezy, had a nice rain shower which is giving everything a really nice colour and contrast. But it's absolutely fantastic, but the woodland does require a bit of a different type of photography because you've got to really give some separation. And unless you happen to have mist or fog, which, let's be honest, rarely happens, you know, we're often not that lucky, then you need to make that separation happen in other ways. So we've got this tree behind me, which is quite nice. It's got a nice form to it, and it's got this lovely light coloured bark, which is in itself making it stand out from the rest of the woodland. But what else can we do? Well, we can open up our aperture, something like f1.8, f2.8, something like that. And that will then mean that the rest of the woodland has a nice bokeh to it and is slightly out of focus, but leaving our tree trunk, as long as we get our focus bang on, nicely sharp. So the composition I've gone for is nice and simple. We're going with a portrait orientation, and we're going with the tree, so starting at the bottom right of the frame and working its way all the way through the frame and leading out the top. So this is the time where you need to ask yourself, how much of the image do you actually want to be pin sharp and in focus? Because where you've got a clearly defined subject like this, obviously you want that to be pin sharp and nicely in focus, but what about the rest of the woodland? See, here I would argue that you don't really want that all to be pin sharp because it just loses your subject in amongst the rest of the trees and the rest of the green. By sort of blurring that out a little bit, you really bring that subject into focus. So what I've done is I've opened up our aperture to f1.8, which on my 85mm lens is the widest it will go. And we're then going to focus right on the tree stump itself. Now, this is the point where we need to work out how much depth of field we really want from this image, because obviously this tree is not one-dimensional. You know, there is a bit of depth to the trunk. It's not quite straight. We've got some branches coming off. If we want all of those to be pin sharp as well, then probably f1.8 is a little bit too open for this shot. So what I'm just going to do, and the easiest way I find to do this, is just to take a series of test shots, one of them at f1.8. If we zoom in on that image, you can see the tree stump perfect. But these branches, as we sort of go off onto the branches that sort of not 100% in focus. Now, the question is, do I want those to be in focus? I don't actually mind them to out of focus, but what I think I might do is take another shot, maybe at f2.8, 2.5. Let's try 2.5. Let's see what we can do there. Refocus, and we'll take another shot there. Again, 2-second timer on, just keep camera shake. Oh, I think we missed focus. Missed focus, that's why it's always pays to check. Let's zoom in, try the autofocus again. Nope, let's do a manual focus. And at f2.5, that's pretty good, and I'm pretty happy with all those branches. Unfortunately, the light's gone in. So at f2.5, that's pretty good. I'm pretty happy with all those branches. They're not too bad, and it keeps the rest of the woodland just out of focus and really draws your eye to the subject, which is that one tree, which is what I wanted. Now, this does bring me on, this shot, to a couple of points when you're taking shots in the woodlands to get sharp images. The first one, as I had to do there, is don't always rely on your autofocus, especially when you've got a small subject and you've got lots of other distractions going on. The camera doesn't always get it right, which is what happened there. And manually focus, nice and easy, zoom in on the live view, focus manually, and you get it bang on. Also, that's why it really pays to check your shots. Don't just blindly take the shot, assume everything's right. Well, now we've covered the camera settings to get that nice sharp image. Let's go through a few of the other tips, some of them obvious, some of them less so, as to what you need to do in order to get a nice sharp image. First one, which you've seen me use all the time, is get a nice sturdy tripod. You ideally want something that has a little bit of weight to it, just so that when it's windy like today, it's not being blown all over the place. And something that's a bit tall. You don't want a really small one and having to use the center column all the time. If you have to use it, you have to use it. Like I am here, I just needed that extra bit of height just to make the image work. But if you can get away without using it, that is ideal, and you'll get less movement in the camera. When you do have to use it, or in fact, to be honest, all the time, because just pressing the shutter release makes a little bit of vibration in the camera, which is not what you want, I put the 2-second timer on. You can buy remotes and fancy things like that, or link it up to your phone and do that. I personally, 2-second timer, and then when you press the shutter, 2 seconds later, your image is taken, and that just gives the camera enough time to settle from pressing that button. Nice and easy, it's built into the camera, don't need any extra gear, it's free, 2-second timer for the win. Next thing is if you've got a DSLR, I don't, I've got mirrorless now, but if you do have a DSLR, switch the camera into live view. And what that'll mean is the mirror is already flipped up in the camera because you'll have the image on the screen. And that means when it takes the shot, there's no physical movement in the camera, and that'll just keep it nice and still again. It's all about trying to remove as much vibration from the camera as possible. Now, if you do happen to have a tripod that's fairly lightweight, they'll often have a hook on the bottom and you can hang your camera bag from it. And in theory, that'll just add a bit of weight and keep it more stable. On a windy day, I don't know if it makes a lot of difference because you then add a huge backpack that's swinging around in the wind. If you've got a light tripod anyway, I think that's just going to worsen, shall we say, the camera shake. So I personally don't bother with that. Now, the other thing in order to get that image nice and sharp and stop this camera vibrating is to remove your camera strap. You'll notice I've never ever shot with a camera strap in any of my videos, just because if you've got it set up on a tripod like this and that's blowing around in the wind, then that's adding vibration to your camera. Now, you may well be saying, well, that's all well and good, but I don't have a nice fancy lens that opens up to f1.8 or f2.8. What can I do then when I want to make my object stand out in the frame? Well, if you've only got the kit lens and your kit lens can zoom in, then that's an alternative. So my kit lens was the 24 to 200 millimeters, and at 200 millimeters, the maximum aperture, or the most open aperture, is f6.3. And that does kind of work. It gives you a nice blurry background, maybe not quite to the same level as what I've just shot, but it's enough to work with, especially if you've got the space and you've got a good distance between your subject and the background, then that's an option. Now, of course, you can calculate all of this, and there are apps to help you do that you can use while you're out in the field to calculate your depth of field and work out how much of the image you're going to get in focus based on your focal length, your aperture, and your distance to the subject. And I will leave a link to a video in the top right where I show you how to do that. But I personally think far more important than that is just to get out with your camera and go and practice, because what works for me with this camera, this lens, in this woodland, with this subject, won't necessarily work for you. So if you get out there, you'll generally start to get a feel for what aperture you need. When you arrive at a scene, you'll just think, this will look good at this aperture and this focal length, and this is what I need to do, and you'll just get to it, and you'll have a really enjoyable time learning, making some mistakes, but you'll get some good images out of it, and you'll become a much, much better photographer than just trying to rely on an app every time you want to take a photo. So now we come on to the final, and in some ways most important point of this video, which is that none of this, to a certain extent, really matters. We'll zoom in as photographers and critique the tiny bit of our subject that we didn't quite get in perfect focus, where the aperture was slightly too wide, or the quality wasn't quite there, or we've gone above f16 and we've introduced some diffraction, and we'll notice it. But the reality is that most won't notice that that tiny bit of the subject isn't perfectly pin sharp and you didn't quite get it right. So stop beating yourself up about it. Unless you're really doing professional work, or you're going to blow up your images and print them huge on the wall, in which case, sure, all of these techniques are needed. But if you did get it wrong, it doesn't matter. It's not the end of the world. A good photo is still good, even if it's not quite 100% pin sharp. So I really hope you've learned something from this. Hopefully you take something away from it. If you have, maybe give it a quick like so the YouTube shows it to some more people. Consider subscribing for some other content, and I really hope to see you soon. But do you want the rest of it in focus and in